A couple months ago, I did a few videos where I reviewed iconic Yu-Gi-Oh! Monsters from the anime, but only talked about them in a competitive sense. In those videos, I mentioned, and I'll mention it in today's video as well, that I don't really watch the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime. I watched the original series when it first came out, and I've seen a couple episodes out of GX and 5D's, but overall, anime just really isn't my thing. But in today's video, what we're going to be doing is reviewing the 5D's Signer Dragons from a competitive standpoint. One of the cool things about these Signer Dragons in particular compared to the other monsters we've reviewed from the anime is that a lot of these cards actually did see competitive use. I don't have to talk about 2500 attack normal monsters, I'm talking about synchro monsters that were actually played across a variety of formats, and that gives us a lot more to dissect in today's video. Starting off with Stardust Dragon, which is a level 8 dragon synchro monster, as all 6 of these are dragon synchro monsters, and it takes 1 tuner plus 1 or more non-tuner monsters. This is one of the very first synchros ever released in the very first synchro pack, and its effect says during either player's turn when a card or effect is activated that would destroy a card on the field, you can tribute this card, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy it. During the end phase, if this effect was activated this turn and was not negated, you can special summon this card from your graveyard, 2500 attack and 2000 defense. Now, Stardust Dragon is a very competitive card. Right from the get-go, a lot of players use this cards in their teleport Dark Arm Dragon decks, but overall this card has seen tons of competitive play across a variety of formats, and that's what makes it so cool. It's really interesting having an ace monster that people actually use. We've now had that happen with a couple of them, but when we think of like the original ones, not a lot of people are competitively playing Dark Magician. So when we get Stardust Dragon comes along here and it's actually being used, that's kind of cool for people that are fans of the anime. So this thing is one of the best generic level 8 synchro monsters. A lot of people use it to negate a ton of different destruction effects. Destruction effects are fairly popular, and what makes this thing so cool is that you can use it on things that destroy your own monsters or your own back row, but you can even do it on things that destroy your opponent's cards. If there's ever effects out there, sometimes people want to destroy their own cards to trigger their graveyard effects, you can use Stardust Dragon to stop those. And what's especially interesting about Stardust Dragon is that once people sort of moved on from synchro summoning, we got into the Xyz era, a lot of people were still playing this card specifically because of Starlight Road. Starlight Road is sort of like a mini Stardust Dragon and actually summon Stardust right from the extra deck for free. If your opponent tried to hit you with a Heavy Storm or Torrential Tribute, you could activate the Starlight Road to negate that effect and then also summon this huge Stardust Dragon for no cost to you, which can then negate another card. Now, unfortunately, when you summon Stardust Dragon with Starlight Road, you don't actually get to revive from the graveyard because it wasn't properly summoned, but overall, it was a sweet 2-for-1 play that got you 2 negations out of that 1 trap card. But even outside of Starlight Road, Stardust Dragon has seen tons of play in pretty much any deck that can make level 8 synchro monsters, even seen play as recently as 2017 in a tournament-topping Zodiac Lightsworn deck that could play cards like Unizami to make things like Cypher Lord Omega and Stardust Dragon. Also released in Duelist Genesis was Red Dragon Archfiend, the second of the Signer Dragons that we'll be discussing. Just like Stardust Dragon, it's a level 8 dragon monster that requires 1 tuner and 1 or more non-tuner monsters. This one has 500 more attack though, as is to be expected with a rival ace monster, and this card's effect says after damage calculation, if this card attacks a defense position monster your opponent controls, destroy all defense position monsters your opponent controls. During your end phase, destroy all other monsters you control that did not declare an attack this turn. This card must be face up on the field to activate and resolve this effect. Now, on paper, you might be wondering, well, what's the uses of Red Dragon Archfiend? Well, back in the day, this card actually was played, and it was played because when your opponent sort of turtled up and summoned a whole bunch of monsters in defense mode, 1 copy of Red Dragon Archfiend could wipe all of them off the field. That was especially good against cards that didn't have floating effects. You basically summon a Regeki with 3000 attack, and it really suits aggressive strategies back when this card first came out. Now, if we're looking at modern competitive Yu-Gi-Oh!, this card is not really played. It is worth briefly mentioning that many versions of this card have seen play at competitive events, things like Scarlet Red Dragon Archfiend and Hot Red Dragon Archfiend, and even right now, Hot Red Dragon Archfiend Abyss is seeing tons of competitive play. So even if Red Dragon Archfiend, the original, isn't seeing so much use in extra decks in 2018 or 2019, at least the other versions of the card are still seeing play even to this day. That brings us to Black Rose Dragon, the first level 7 Signer Dragon that we'll talk about in today's video. Now, Black Rose Dragon, once again, is a generic synchro monster, and it says, when this card is synchro summoned, you can destroy all cards on the field. Once per turn, you can banish one plant monster from your graveyard, then target one defense position monster your opponent controls, change that target to face-up attack position, and if you do, its attack becomes 0 until the end of this turn. Now, even though this card has like a paragraph of text, in 90% of the cases, when you're summoning this card, you're only using its first effect. Just like how Red Dragon Archfiend was sort of a Regeki with 3000 attack, Black Rose Dragon is basically a dark hole, but it actually is a heavy storm as well, and that gives it a lot of utility. This card was very, very good when it came out, and more so than any of the other Signer Dragons, this is the one that still see the most play even in 2019. Now, that is partly due to the effectiveness of a card like Destrudo, which basically turns any monster on your field into a level 7 synchro monster. But overall, Black Rose Dragon is still seeing play in synchro decks that are playing cards like Destrudo, but even in decks that aren't playing Destrudo, if they're playing tuner monsters and if they can make level 7 synchros, a lot of the time you are seeing Black Rose Dragon being played. This card is super good. It is one of the only cards in the game that you can summon relatively easily and actually destroy all the cards on the field. It sort of is like an Evil Storm Exciton Knight for synchro monsters, but a lot easier to trigger because you don't actually have to have any card deficit. I mean, obviously you want to use it when you have less cards than your opponent, but you can have more cards than your opponent, just less cards on the field. You can blow up the entire board. It doesn't even matter. And also it has that bonus effect that works with plant monsters. That doesn't come up too often, but in decks that used to play Black Rose Dragon like Plant Synchro, you would sometimes be able to activate that effect. Overall, Black Rose Dragon might be the best Signer Dragon out there, even better than Stardust Dragon if we're just looking at the sheer amount of formats this card has seen play in. However, while Black Rose Dragon might be the most used Signer Dragon, Ancient Fairy Dragon is the only one that's banned. It is also level 7, and this card was banned directly because of Destrudo, the card that I just mentioned you can make Black Rose with, and that's for a good reason, because on paper, a lot of people don't seem to think Ancient Fairy Dragon is that good. I get a lot of Duel Links players that ask things like, well, how is this card banned in the TCG? Well, let's take a look at its effects. So it says, once per turn, you can special summon one level 4 or lower monster from your hand. You cannot conduct your battle phase turn you activate its effect, and also, once per turn, you can destroy as many field spells on the field as possible, and if you do, gain 1000 life points, then you can add one field spell from the deck to their hand. This card did not see any play for years in the TCG. You saw some fringe strategies using this, but overall, it wasn't until more modern decks came out that people really started abusing Ancient Fairy Dragon to the point that it got banned. The biggest benefit from this card is the special summon effect from your hand. That might seem minor, but in decks where you need one extra monster on the board to start your combos, this is a card that you're going to use. All it took to make this card was like an Armageddon Knight sending Destrudo to the graveyard, and suddenly you have these crazy OTK and FTK combos out there. It didn't help this card. Well, I guess in some ways it helped the card be really good, but in other ways it didn't help it because it got it banned. The fact that this card is level 7 meant that people oftentimes were overlaying into number 42 Galaxy Tomahawk and making a whole board of Link monsters using the tokens, and that is just a very degenerate thing that Konami wanted to prevent. And also, the field spell effect is pretty darn good if you're playing a deck that has a field spell that isn't a hard once per turn. You can summon Ancient Fairy Dragon with Armageddon Knight and Destrudo, activate your field spell, get like a free search or whatever that field spell does, then use Ancient Fairy Dragon to destroy your own field spell and add the exact same field spell from your deck to your hand, and then activate that one to get even more advantage. This is one of those weird cards that sort of got reverse power creep. Most Yu-Gi-Oh cards get worse as time goes on, but in the case of some cards out there like Ancient Fairy Dragon, they actually get better as time goes on, and in this case it got so powerful that Konami decided to ban it for good, or at least for now. Blackwing Dragon isn't a Blackwing monster. It does not technically work with any of the Blackwing support because Black Winged is not the same thing as a Black Wing. If we're looking at card text, a Blackwing monster has to use Black Wing as one word, not the way that it's spelled out here, just to clear up any confusion. This card is also terrible and probably wouldn't even be good if it was an actual Blackwing monster. Basically, even though this card has an entire paragraph of text, all that really matters is the first text, and that says, if you would take damage from a card effect, place one Black Feather counter on this card instead. This card loses 700 attack for each Black Feather counter on it. And while that might seem good because it is technically a hard counter to any burn deck out there, the fact of the matter is that there are tons of cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! That that stop burn damage, and those ones usually aren't level 8 synchro monsters. I'm sure just like on any time I call a card bad, there'll be comments on this video from people saying they summoned this card against their chain burn opponent at locals and instantly won the game. And while that's cool and I'm glad that you won that match, this card is just not very good in a realistic bunch of scenarios, therefore it hasn't been played very often. It is worth mentioning, just as an aside, this is actually the very first ghost rare that I pulled. It was very exciting and I really sort of have a soft spot in my heart for this card, even if it's pretty darn bad. When I first set out to make this video, I thought that Power Tool Dragon was the 6th Signer Dragon. However, I have since found out that that is not the case, and I asked you guys on Twitter to explain it to me. I really haven't watched any of 5D's, especially whenever that transition happened. The top comment right now is when Leo officially transformed into a Signer and got his birthmark, which apparently was Season 5, Power Tool Dragon evolved into Lifestream Dragon, which symbolized him becoming a Signer. There's also a couple different comments like that Power Tool Dragon isn't a dragon type, it's a machine type, and also there's been some issues with, I guess, whoever was making the TV show didn't quite realize that Crow would be such a popular character, so they sort of shoehorned him in as a Signer, and they had to give Leo something to end up with. But I don't really know why this card is not a Signer card, but we're going to talk about Lifestream Dragon, which apparently is the Signer Dragon card from the anime. Hilariously, while Power Tool Dragon is a very competitive card, Lifestream Dragon isn't. It's a level 8 synchro monster that specifically requires you to have 1 tuner and Power Tool Dragon, which means you have to summon a good card first and then downgrade it into whatever this thing is. This card says when this card is synchro summoned, you can make your life point become 4,000. You take no effect damage. If this face-up card on the field will be destroyed, you can banish 1 equip spell from your graveyard instead. I understand where Konami was coming from when they designed this card. Obviously, it's supposed to work in the same decks that Power Tool Dragon works. The fact of the matter is that Power Tool Dragon is a very competitive card and it has some crazy combos surrounding it, but Lifestream Dragon is simply not a worthy upgrade of Power Tool Dragon and therefore hasn't seen any competitive play in any format that I remember. Anyway though, that's pretty much gonna wrap up today's video on reviewing every single Signer Dragon from 5D's. I hope you guys really enjoyed this discussion. I know I don't know a lot about the anime. I'm sure to some people that's super cringy, but I still think it's cool to review these iconic anime monsters and sort of talk about how good or bad they were in a competitive sense, because obviously in the anime there's going to be plot armor, there's going to be convoluted situations, but how good are these cards actually? And in the case of these Signer Dragons, you might notice that 4 out of 6 of them have actually seen competitive play, which is pretty cool and definitely a higher batting average than the ace monsters that we reviewed a couple months ago. Anyway though, I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.